Mr. Chairman and very distinguished colleagues, I indeed feel it a privilege to be here, and I'm grateful to the Samuel Nieman Institute, particularly Professor Liron and Professor Moser, for giving me this opportunity to come for the first time to Israel and to come for this conference and make this presentation on a topic on which I've been working for quite some time. But I also find a topic which is becoming increasingly complex and difficult. What I'm going to do is, I was asked to give a presentation not on India, but on Asian countries. And that makes my job much more difficult. Essentially because India is a diverse country, Asia is much more diverse. The variations between different countries are so high that we cannot make a generalized statement. But where angels fear to tread, the fools do. And I do make some generalized statements. What I call them as stylized facts. Stylized facts are very, very simple truths with very few exceptions, but generally agreed. So I make a few, perhaps a handful of statements, somewhat a little bit provocative. But I also wish to make it very clear in the very beginning itself that we have a very, very weak database on private higher education institutions. Daniel Levy is coordinating the Prof project, which is collecting huge amount of data, but still it is very, very limited in terms of indicators on which we have the data. The others are like OECD and UNESCO's data, which are again subject to quite a few errors and margins of, quite big margins of error. There are also problems with the definition of what is meant by private, what is meant by public. So many of these publications, official and unofficial publications, do not make a very, very clear distinction so that we can make a very clear distinction about the policy choices. Given these caveats, I'm going to make a few statements. But before that, let me say it. The public policies with respect to private education in many countries in general, and Asian countries in particular, are in a confusing state. Confusing state because the governments do not know what to do. There are ideological differences. There are practical differences. There are practical compulsions also on many of these, particularly the developing countries in Asia, given particularly after the introduction of the new economic reform policies or neoliberal policies. So some governments have accepted these policies out of compulsion, and very, very few governments have accepted these policies out of any strong conviction, stating that private education is good or efficient or improves equity, equality, etc. Some of the claims that the proponents of private education make it. In fact, I could find 3 or 4 kinds of policies in different countries. Some policies which are strongly public, pro-public, or in favor of public sector, which could also be read as anti-private policies. They do not want the private systems to come up at all. There are some countries which would like to have private education, but a regulated private education system, or unregulated private education system, and if it's already there, some kind of a deregulation is also being talked about, but essentially in favor of private education, expansion of the private system. There are some countries where the policies are clearly pro-private, encourage the private sector under different names, but there are also countries where there are no clear policies and no clear vision what to do. So they leave it to the markets, or what can be described as laissez-faireism policies, but which work in favor of the markets, which work in favor of the private sector. We also talk about public-private partnerships, which I strongly feel are working largely in favor of the private sector, or the balance is in favor of the private sector in the educational activities. Now, there can be, in fact, different kinds of typology of policies, but I thought this kind of policy type classification would be useful. Let me make a few statements, as I said. Number one, which is very well known to everybody. Particularly in the Asian countries, the higher education system is exploding like anything in numbers, and the private education system is also exploding in a good number of countries, with very, very few exceptions. It's increasing in such a large proportion that the relative size of the public sector is becoming quite tiny, minuscule. In fact, a phenomenon that I call private sector is actually crowding out the public sector in terms of the higher education institutions, higher educational programs, and variety of other indicators that I will briefly refer to. It's also helping the governments, particularly the weak governments which do not have strong policies, to take the excuse not to be involved with respect to the development of education, or I say the abdication of the responsibility by the state to promote higher education. Because already there is a big private sector and the government doesn't feel the need to open any more public institutions. Now when we say private, I think, again, Professor Neave has given a wonderful classification of the private institutions, and in the literature also there are quite a few alternative classifications. 3 or 4 types that are taking place in a good number of Asian countries is one, setting up of private institutions. Private institutions which are state-funded private institutions, which has been a phenomenon for a very long period, but that is still there, though it's not increasing at a good rate of growth compared to the other kinds of private institutions. There are some philanthropic private institutions, which could be called something like non-profit private institutions, but essentially based upon the considerations of charity, philanthropy, providing education to the poor, and without any economic gains or economic motives. The third kind of private institutions that are coming up in large numbers, and that's the phenomenon of the current last 2-3 decades, is setting up the profit-making private institutions. And again, in almost all countries of the region, this kind of institutions is increasing at a higher rate of growth compared to the state-funded private institutions or philanthropic private institutions. There are also some efforts in some of the countries where public sector disinvestment takes place and public institutions are getting privatized, actually being given to the private sector. But not in a large number, but that is happening in quite a few cases. What is happening perhaps more significantly is financial privatization of the public institutions with increased cost recovery rates, particularly student institutions of various kinds. There are lots of discussions on public policies with respect to higher education getting confined to what should be the fees in public education, what should be the rate of cost recovery, and how it can be increased further and further. There are also several public institutions which are starting completely self-financing courses that are completely dependent on only tuition fees. And that's a phenomenon that's coming up in large quantity in India, and perhaps it's also coming in quite a few other countries. Now, some fixed statistics that you find, the private higher education institutions that include private universities and also private other non-university institutions are increasing in large numbers. And in some countries, this is coming to nearly 96% of all educational institutions are in the private sector. Even in China, which didn't have many private institutions a decade and a half ago or so, nearly 40% of the institutions are in the private sector. All this database is largely from Prof and OECD data. So we can find that there are some countries where the private sector is quite dominant, like Japan, Korea, but also countries like Malaysia and Indonesia. There are some countries where the private sector is something like peripheral, as a classification that Roger Giger has used quite some time back. Countries like Taiwan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Thailand, etc. And there are also countries where private sector is quite insignificant, like Sri Lanka or Singapore or Hong Kong to some extent. There are some institutions, but the number is extremely limited. There is another form of private institutions. Again, this is also a type that is taking place in almost all institutions. They are unrecognized institutions. In fact, in Indian terminology, we call them as fake universities, offering fake degrees, and quite often cheating the public. They are unrecognized. They are also unrecognizable because many of these institutions are set up in big shopping malls, and you have to identify, you have to locate, where is it? So in a sense, they are really unrecognizable. But they are also unrecognizable essentially because they do not follow any considerations of education, or they are not regulated by any kind of regulations of the government with respect to fees, with respect to programs, with respect to any activity. To such an extent that some of these institutions are set up under the Shops Act, not educational institutions, and some other acts. So they are, but that's also a big number, and unfortunately we don't have any information about the size of these institutions or what is happening in those institutions. In fact, even with respect to the completely recognized private institutions, the information that we get is very, very limited, and I'll briefly comment a bit later. With the rapid growth in the private institutions during the last 2 to 3 decades, essentially from 1980, in the beginning of the 1980s or so, we come to a situation where the Asian developing countries really surpass some of the developed countries with respect to whatever degree of privatization that you can think of. As a result, today India is much more privatized than a country like the United States, if you look at the higher education system. A couple of quick data that I can give. A case like the United States, where 1/4 of the students are in the private institutions. But if you look at India or some other Asian countries, in Philippines, more than 2/3 of the students are in the private sector. And again, another 2/3 are in Indonesia, Malaysia, and Korea, of course. Korea and Japan are exceptions where the numbers are much larger. Now, as I said, the private sector is growing at such a level that the public sector is getting crowded out to a great extent. And with some modifications of a diagram that was given by Professor Uma Koshi, I thought of putting this figure. Public sector is very small. It increased a little bit, but again, then it became stable. Then we have a huge private sector that's coming up, and the pressures are so high that the space, public space available for the public institutions is getting squeezed and squeezed. And it's coming almost to negligible proportions. A phenomenon that I question whether the Graham's law of money in economics will operate in education sector too. Graham's law of money for non-economists is bad money drives good money out of circulation, finally, and bad money rules in the whole system. I don't know whether such a law will operate with respect to the educational institutions. Now, the growth in the private sector in many of these institutions is essentially because of 2 or 3 important factors. The domestic conditions saying that the governments do not have money. There is an excess demand excess over what the government can supply. In fact, in the literature, I think Estelle James have long ago explained the demand for private education in terms of excess demand and differentiated demand. Differentiated demand is the demand for different quality, different types, different religious education, etc., which is not provided by the public institutions. What I feel is that in many of these developing countries, it is the excess demand phenomenon that explains why private institutions are coming up and not the differentiated demand, because many of the institutions are secular and ideologically indifferent. And the only ideological consideration is economic gains. Countries also, governments also are increasingly saying that there are no resources, whether rich or poor countries. Particularly, there are no resources for higher education systems. And the market forces are so strong, in general, with respect to every activity, after the introduction of the economic reform policies in countries like India and China. And the government mechanisms that we have are extremely weak. In fact, so weak that they cannot regulate. There is a general argument that we can have private institutions, but they need to be regulated by the government. But the mechanisms of the government in terms of regulating bodies, their effectiveness is extremely limited. We have really very, very soft governments in terms of their ability to control the quality, ensure good quality and standards with respect to the private institutions. And as I said, there are laissez-faire policies. There are no policies at all that's helping the private sector to set up the institutions. There is also a large international environment which is favoring the growth of the private institutions, particularly as referred to the neoliberal policies, which are known as structural adjustment policies. And almost all the developing countries in Asia are having some kind of adjustment policies. And second, of course, with the introduction of higher education in the WTO and GATS, there are strong forces which are working for the expansion of the private sector. Introduction of the private sector in those countries where it's not there, and expansion in where it's already there. Fact number 2. What I find over the years, if you look at during the last 3, 4, 5 decades or so, there is a very, very significant decline in philanthropy in the higher education sector, in the educational sector, and there is a very, very clear shift in favor of profit-making institutions, setting up the profit-making institutions. Now, earlier, particularly in the middle of the century, 1950s, 60s, etc., where at what time the countries have become recently independent, people, corporate sector, community in general was very patriotic and tried to help the governments with private contributions to the public institutions. Today, such donations and endowments are becoming increasingly negligible scarce. For example, in India, there used to be something like 12 to 13% of the total educational budget used to come from donations from the private sector. Private sector including contributions from the community in general. Today, less than 3% is the contribution that we get. There is what we refer to the state-supported private sector, which is somewhat philanthropic in nature, which used to be somewhat philanthropic in nature, the government doesn't want any more such institutions to come up, or the private sector doesn't want to set up, both. The private sector also doesn't want to set up any more institutions of this kind because they are completely regulated by the government. Because the state funding is to a very great extent, in large number of countries, more than 95% of the budget requirements are met by the government, even in these private institutions. So in contrast, we have a very rapid growth in what can be called the self-financing private sector or profit-making private institutions. Even the charitable private institutions that were set up much earlier are tending to become commercial institutions with different kinds of motives. The term philanthropy is disappearing in the educational discourses, and the term profits are coming into the system essentially because there is a large-scale change in the attitudes of the people in favor of personal economic gains, if not personal greed, and in terms of acceptance of the phenomenon of profit in education. Certainly, I remember in 70s and 80s, even early 80s, in the educational policy discussions in India and quite a few other countries, profit was a dirty term. But today, it's quite a respectable, acceptable term. What's wrong with having profit-making education institutions? And we have classifications like for-profit institutions and non-profit institutions as legally accepted terminology. And as a result, many private sector individuals are ready to set up profit-making institutions. Fact number 3. About the quality of educational institutions. Some of the institutions have excellent buildings and nothing else inside. So I say all that glitters is not gold. If you look at the quality of the private institutions, in terms of quite a few indicators on which we have the data, I think it was also referred earlier in the earlier presentations. There are high student-faculty ratios in the private institutions. The low-quality teachers, in fact, many of the teachers are not necessarily sufficiently qualified. Very few institutions have doctoral faculty with doctoral degrees, and quite a few other aspects. There is inadequate infrastructure in terms of laboratories, in terms of libraries, in terms of journals that are subscribed by the libraries, etc. They are also relatively small in size in terms of the number of students that they take it. And also, this is also an aspect that came up in the earlier session, is many of these private institutions focus on offering what can be known as marketable disciplines, whether it is business management or computer engineering, but certainly not sciences, social sciences or natural sciences, physical sciences, etc., because they are not marketable, they are not much revenue generating. Certainly, of course, most private institutions do not focus on research at all. Now, one of the important indicators that we can take with respect to the quality of quality of higher education institutions in the absence of detailed data is look at the world university ranking. Now, if you look at the top 200 ranking, almost all the institutions are in the public sector. In the Asian region, non-public institutions are the only case that we find is in South Korea. All other institutions, whether they're of course very small in number, one institution in India and 5 or 6 universities in Japan, 5 universities in China, all of them are in public sector. So many of the private institutions have really questionable quality with respect to several indicators of internationally accepted quality indicators. As I said, many of the institutions are also very small in size. If you look at it, for example, Thailand has 45% of the universities are in the private sector, but it captures only 13% of the enrollments. So is the case with respect to many other countries. 92% of the enrollments in universities in Malaysia are in the private universities. Not the students, the institutions. Only 23% of the students are in these universities. So it's already described in quite a few places that many of these private universities, I'm not referring to the colleges, the private universities in the Asian countries are equivalent to something like community colleges and cannot be really described as universities. Fact number 4. One of the important features that distinguishes between, I think, the US model Professor Neave has referred to, is the exclusive reliance on the student fees. If you look at any private institution in the Asian countries, with some exception, but not really a high degree of exception of Japan and Korea, almost all the other institutions completely depend upon students' fees. Private sector's own contribution in terms of their own investment in developing the infrastructure, capital, or recurring expenditures are very, very limited. And even if some expenditure is incurred, that's automatically recovered within a very short period with interest from the students. Freeships, scholarships, etc. are highly controversial. In fact, they are not offered in many private universities. In fact, that's one clause why the whole private sector opposed in India when a private university bill was to be proposed. The government insisted that 10% of the students should be given free shapes. Private sector said no, and the whole bill wasn't still hanging in fact. And the institutions also do not try to generate resources from any other source. I mean, those private aided institutions, government-supported institutions get more than 95% from the government, and these profit-making or self-financing institutions completely depend upon the students. There is nothing like a third source where there are charity, contributions, etc., the kind that we find, particularly in North America and United States. It's quite understandable that the fees in the private institutions is much larger than, obviously, public institutions. But if you look at the ratio between the private institutions and the fees in the private institutions and the public institutions, if it's $1,000 in a public institution, students' fees for a master's program, in the private institutions it's 50 to 80 times higher. But in some of the countries on which we have the data, I think it's only 3 to 8 times higher. In Japan it's 8 times, and the United States 3 times higher. Even if you look at the cost recovery rate or fees as a percent of the total cost of education, most of the private institutions, as I said, completely depend upon students. While in public institutions, about 15 to 20% comes from the government and the remaining from the students, and the remaining comes from the government. Okay. If you look at, again, the cost recovery rates in quite a few countries, in the private institutions, private universities on which we have the data, in the United States, the cost recovery rate is something like 25%. In Japan and Asia, which is a developed country, again, 59% is paid by the students. South Korea is higher, and Philippines and other countries is much higher. And in India and many other developing countries, more than 100% comes from the students. India, Pakistan, and all other countries. Come on. I think there is a fundamental difference between the US model of higher education, and that's what Professor Neave was also saying in the morning, and the Asian model of private education institutions. In the West, the universities like Harvard were set up essentially on philanthropy-based considerations, charity-based considerations to improve equity, to improve quality, and attract the best staff and students from everywhere. But if you look at the developing countries, essentially the private sector has come up because the supply side is limited. The government has limited resources, and the government is really withdrawing the investments in the public sector. And the private individuals have the profit motive to set up. So the considerations are completely different. And as a result, we have completely different kinds of model. Recently, Lawrence Summers was there in Delhi, and he was saying the Asian model, particularly the East Asian model that he was referring to, is not the best model of developing higher education, private higher education systems in the developing countries. Fact number 5. What we found is countries which are dependent upon private higher education systems to a great extent, or in the standard literature what we call private dominant higher education systems, have not necessarily developed much, either educationally or socially and economically. In fact, internationally, we have reasonably a good amount of information to say that. The other way is also quite true. Countries which have strong public higher education systems have developed much better, both economically and educationally. And I said the only exceptions that we have is Japan and Korea models. Now, quickly, if you look at it, like with respect to the higher education development as a whole, more than 2/3 of the students in the Philippines are in the private universities. But if you look at the enrollment ratio in overall higher education system, it's only 28%. Certainly, you do not find any relationship at all. An equal proportion of students are in the private sector in Indonesia, but the enrollment ratio is 17%. So higher the enrollment ratio in private institutions, it does not automatically increase access and increase the gross enrollment ratios. In fact, we can find a large-scale evidence to show that. Even with a small enrollment ratio in private institutions, you can expand the higher education systems better, just as Thailand has, at least as far as this data is concerned. Let me try to conclude with 1 or 2 final observations. What is increasingly known is that private institutions do not have some of the considerations that the public institutions are expected to have. That's also a statement that was made in the morning with respect to the Israeli case. They are excluded from any social considerations that the state has with respect to the public good nature or with respect to other considerations. The quality of many of the programs that are being offered in the private institutions is questionable. And with respect to resource allocation, the public allocation of resources, what is happening is the public sector directly and indirectly subsidizes much more these private institutions and leaving little money for the public institutions. A phenomenon I call public pauperization and private enrichment. I also said that the growth of the private sector is resulting in crowding out of the public sector. And what we are losing essentially is something like the public good nature of higher education. In fact, many private institutions and the proponents of private education do not accept the concept of public good at all, saying that it's not relevant at all with respect to the higher education system. In terms of the disciplines, in terms of the areas of study, in terms of regional development, in terms of other aspects, in fact, we are losing a balanced development of higher education system in the country, and we are having a highly skewed development of the system. Now, why at all public education is important and private sector cannot do? There are theoretical reasons and there are also practical reasons many of you know very well. The externalities that it produces are immense with respect to social, economic, political, apart from technological and economic. It's a merit good. It's also an experience good, which cannot be priced easily. And one of the important objectives of higher education everywhere is the provision of equality of opportunities. Higher education also produces multiple outputs in terms of research, in terms of teaching, in terms of quality, in terms of graduates and values it produces. So some of them are tangible and some of them are intangible. What is also increasingly accepted even by the proponents of the private markets in education is the imperfections in the capital market and asymmetric information. The information that we get from the private institutions is extremely limited. And there are no mechanisms to get really reliable data with respect to the quality of the institutions, quality of the programs that they offer, etc. What's the final point? Now, the choice is there are failures with respect to the private institutions, what we call market failures. There are also failures with respect to the public sector, which are called government failures. And we have to choose between the government failures and the market failures, which is good, which is tolerable, and which is rather less damaging than the other. I'll leave with that question here. And let me end up with a final statement from a Cuban, I think, a Mexican philosopher, that public education is the foundation of the prosperity of the nations. Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry if I take a little bit more time.
We'll ask Professor Dogramaci to come up now and continue this absolutely stimulating opening to the session, and really delighted to have you.
Did you learn how to use this? Yes. It's a pleasure and a privilege for me to be with you today here at Technion. It's my first time in Haifa, beautiful city, and I'd like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me here. I was asked to talk about private university experience in Turkey, in particular the institution I'm involved in, and so I'll try to do that, and I'll try to fit the time schedule as our chair dictates. Let me see, how do I, so we do like this, no, like this, like this. Would you like the mouse? No, I just, yes, okay, I'll let you. This is good enough, thank you. I'll just do it from here. No, how to turn the page, but I know it. Okay, I come. Right. Oh, this one works, that's all right. That's all right, that's all right. Thank you. So the country I come from has a population of 72 million, and we have 85 state universities and 30 what you might call private universities. But actually, legally, there are no private universities in Turkey. Hence the question, how private are these private universities? And that's what I'll try to address. The Council of Higher Education in Turkey, called YÖK, Yüksek Öğretim Kurulu, and ÖSYM, the Student Selection and Placement Center, these two acronyms are well into Turkish vocabulary. They shape our lives. And Articles 130 and 31 of the Turkish Constitution allow for non-profit institutions of higher learning to do higher education under the supervision of the Council of Higher Education. And they are allowed freedom in their administrative styles to some extent, in their management and finances to some extent, but they are subject to both regulations of the Council of Higher Education, the Ministry of Finance, as well as Ministry of Education. Now, how do students enter university in Turkey? So, I'm just 18 years old, just graduated from high school. I take the state exam. Whether I want to go into a foundation university or a state university, I take a state exam. And after that, I put my rankings. Suppose I want to be an industrial engineer, which I think I am. And I live in Istanbul, so I'll write Koç University, my first choice, with scholarship. Koç is a private foundation university. They have scholarship and non-scholarship things. So I'll say I'll get into, my first choice is Koç University if I get the non-scholarship one. And there may be 30 slots there. But if I can't make it with the scores I get from the test, my second choice will be Boğaziçi University, State University, so I don't have to say scholarship or not. Third choice, Istanbul Technical. Fourth choice, okay, I'm willing to dish out money and pay Koç its tuition. But if not, I'll go for mathematics in Boğaziçi University. So I give 20 such choices. And depending on, well, what happens is 1.5 million, more than 1.5 million students take that test. It's like your SAT 1 in the States, almost like that. And the ones with the highest scores enter where they want. The ones with the lower scores enter their lower choices. And the ones even with lower scores don't enter at all. That's how it is. So the students choose their universities and departments as soon as they graduate from the high school. Universities don't pick them. Even if you say, I'm a Bilkent University, private. No, I can't do that. This is run by the state, and this is how it is done. We tell them how many students we can admit in each program. And the government agency places it. Now, if you look at the highest, well, the tests, we have quantitative, verbal, and a mixture of that equally weighted. 3 categories. Quantitative is more rarat, so I just gave that as an example. And with those you can enter engineering or numerous places. Business school and law school would be equally weighted category, not quantitative scores. So if you look at the top 100 students who had the highest quantitative score in 2005, 2006, 2003, total 500 of them, 500 students. Where did they want to go? They picked 147 of them chose Boğaziçi University. They could have gone anywhere. They picked there. 140 of them picked Bilkent, a foundation university. And so it goes like this. So when you look at that, and when you say, well, but about what the number, if you add up the red numbers, and there are 30 foundation universities. If you add up the black numbers, there are 85 state universities or so. It's difficult to say that state universities are more popular than foundation universities or vice versa by this measure. Shows bad. This intended to read electrical engineering. Sorry. In terms of majors, where do they pick? I should have gone. I had 3 files, but, well, I should have checked my PowerPoint, I'm sorry. Electrical engineering, most popular. Trying to read. Medicine, yes, medicine. Nice, thank you. You can read it better than that. Excellent. Cryptography. Computer science. So these are the majors. Okay. There is one there, engineering or natural sciences, to be decided later, 19 of them. Other than that, all of them pick their departments in there at the time of the entrance of the university. Okay. So if you ask, well, why can't, say, for example, Dartmouth versus Bennington College, they're both supposedly private universities, and they can decide which way they want to admit. Why can't you do that over there? In Turkey, the view is public fairness in terms of, well, if you say as a private university you want to weigh this or that, will it be fair? After all, we don't have good supply demand. 1.5 million students take the exam. Less than 500,000 enter the university. So might as well level ground, they say. We all say yes, sir, and or ma'am. And so whether you're private or foundation or state, you obey the rules. Now, there have been times when there have been challenges. Sabancı University, a foundation university, said, I'm not going to make my students choose their majors at the time of their entry to the university. I'm not going to do that. They said they can say, pick the category, Sabancı University, engineering or natural sciences. That's it. And at the end of their second year, sophomore year, they can pick their majors, and they got away with it. So that was a departure from the state control. Another one, another foundation university, they said, look, this is fine, your multiple choice exam or so, but I like so-and-so high school, and I'd like to give scholarships to students from that high school. And they did. But their books get examined every year by Council of Higher Education. And they noticed that scholarships are going to these students who didn't have those categories of entry in the university entrance exam. Said, you can't do that. Well, the founders of that university then said, that's all right. We've got other foundations. We'll let them give scholarships to those, and since the foundations are not under the purview of the Council of Higher Education, Council of Higher Education said, so long as the university itself doesn't pay it, other sources can, and that's how they, so there have been times when you could get outside the rules, but in effect, this is as far as you depart. All right. Now, in the 1960s, 1970s, the Turkish constitution said higher education can be carried out by state universities. What in effect this means is, no matter how good a research you're going to do in a private university, no matter how non-profit you are, you cannot exist. That's what it meant. So, and the way it happened was we took our university system from continental Europe, where this was how it was, and that's how we did it. Now, there was one private college, Robert College, that existed prior to the founding of the Turkish Republic. So it was grandfathered. But in the 1970s, in their infinite wisdom, they also nationalized it. So there was none. Until 1980s. In 1980s, the constitution was changed to allow for non-profit universities to be established by foundations. And the Council of Higher Education was also established then. And, well, the guy who did it is my father, both who convinced the lawmakers to allow for such universities, as well as founding president of the Council of Higher Education, as well as founder of Bilkent, as well as founder of a state university before Bilkent. I'll get to that. So Bilkent admitted its first students in 86, 93, second private university, Koç University, and then today there are 30 of them. In Bilkent, say this last 12 months, our cash inflow was about $202 million. About $96 million of it was from student tuition. We have about 12,000 students. 30% of them, endowments of the university. What are our endowments? Professor Rector mentioned, you guys make money. And the way Bilkent was founded was my father gave ownership of more than 40 companies to the university as an endowment. And also a large land. Now, say in Columbia or Stanford, their endowment includes stocks, bonds, and land. But Turkish stock market is thin and volatile, especially in its founding years. The university needs a lot of cash because capital expenditure, you keep building buildings too. So if you own the whole company, you can at times break it and take the money even if business is bad, which we did. but we still have enough today. So the ownership of it's managed by a business group. At the end of the year, we say we take so much of your money. And that's our endowment. And it helps because, for example, one of them is one of the leading construction companies. We also force them to build our buildings in time. So compared to regular companies where a person owns it, here now nobody owns it. By the way, what's a university, foundation university in Turkey? It's not a non-profit corporation. Legally, it's a public legal entity. That's what it is. It's established by an act of parliament. And so it's not something where there are owners. There is a board of trustees. With mine, my father is the chairman of the board of trustees. And in the board of trustees, we have most of the members are professors in other universities. Ankara, Istanbul Technical University, Hacettepe University, lots of scholars. A few very rich people. And by the way, after they stay with us for a while, they go and start their own foundation and so forth. So that's our fund. The companies are owned by the university. The board of trustees members cannot take any money. But compared to who owns those companies? The university. So the money they make, the money those companies make, do not go to any person. That's what makes that endowment different. Okay. And we do get research support from state. And, well, these percentages speak to themselves. For example, our library, we spend about $3 million for new books and journals each year. For Berkeley, it's nothing. But in Turkey, this is the biggest expenditure. And by the way, our library is open to public 7 days a week, 362 days a year. And I must say, state university libraries are not open to public. But we feel, well then why was Bilkent founded? The first university my father founded at that time, in the 50s, 60s, state university alone, it's Hacettepe University. Still today, the best medical school in the country. It's a state university. But it had a special law. He was able to convince the lawmakers to have a special law for Hacettepe. And for example, there in the hospital, he made all the physicians full-time. They couldn't have private practice. He said, my foundations will support your salaries. But in 73, they changed the law. And they said, no, they can, all universities are saying they can work outside. Gradually then, the foundation stood aside until he was able to get the new law, which allowed these. So what do these resources mean? Can we do things that the state universities do marvelous things? But maybe there are others that we could do. And that's what then Bilkent is established for, or other state universities. Okay. Of our 12,000 students, 3,000 of them are on our own scholarship. They don't pay any money. We pay them stipend and others as well. Now, if you look at our assistant associate and full professors, more than 3/4 of them were in North America and Western Europe. Because of the Bilkent job offer today, they are in Turkey. So we did achieve reverse brain drain. Also, we do not discriminate. In a state university, you can be an American, a Canadian, an Israeli, and you can teach there as a visitor. But to be a regular staff, you have to be a civil servant. To be a civil servant, you have to have Turkish citizenship. But with Bilkent, after all, we're free in our administration. Anything goes. So I've got 2 Brits in my university senate at this time, several department chairs. Once we had one of my vice rectors, an American. We don't discriminate. We're currently just Canada, UK, and USA. I've got 206 of my teaching staff. 1/3 or 30% of my teaching staff is international. Okay. So these are advantages of not being a state university, because I'm not bound by those rules, so we can recruit from a wider pool. By the way, we teach in English, so that makes it easy. Now, another example. My Department of History. Well, I've got Turkish teaching staff, and they are pretty good. For example, Halil İnalcık has honorary doctorates from. He's a leading Ottoman historian. And look at the countries he got his honorary doctorate from. They were all part of Ottoman Empire, now independent, saying, I want to give an honorary doctorate to that Turkish Ottoman historian. So I'm pretty proud of my professors. But we also have, in our Department of History, professors from Britain. And by the way, all students of our Department of History are on full scholarship. History for us is important. There are several topics where if you enter there, you get your own scholarship. Okay. So how do we say we're doing good? We look for external benchmarks. And actually, that's how, for example, I joined Bilkent. In the beginning, I was in the Board of Trustees, 86. And I would come and go. And they brought in the regulation, the provost at that time, and said, well, the regulations for appointment and promotion were pretty much same as the leading universities in Turkey. Department proposes, dean supports, rectorate says okay, and that's it, you get appointed. And by the way, there's a Turkish procedure. You get letters from other Turkish professors in the country. 3 of them, it's good enough. Well, so we said, so my proposal in the Board of Trustees was, why don't you go and look at the leading universities in the world, especially North America, USA, see how they do it. Report to us. Let's not vote on this. So that regulation was put aside. A couple of meetings later, again, it came same. I said, how can you bring it same? You were supposed to show us what other universities, leading universities do. We discussed that before we vote on this. And the provost said, I looked at it, it doesn't fit us. And then I decided I better leave US and come. You have to be on the ground. Many people came to Bilkent, not because of high salary, we give decent salaries, not because, but it's a platform on which you can do things. So, to get appointed, you get those confidential letters. USA, Canada, Israel, Japan, they write very serious letters, they're very confidential. Not every country is used to that, by the way. But that's our appointment. And the appointment promotion system, there's a rule. Columbia has an ad hoc committee for each candidate for associate or full professorship. Rutgers had a standing committee. I taught them. We kept this large standing committee of scholars, no administrators there. Oh, the provost chairs, but then the rest are, you can't be a chair or a dean and be a member of that committee, and you have to be a good scholar, confidential. And that's, and if a candidate doesn't pass through there, doesn't go. So they are the people who read the international letters and this and that. Okay. So we, just like engineering schools in the USA, we get reviewed by ABET. We also follow our graduates. How do they do? Because, and their feedback is important. By the way, I'm an industrial engineer. I'll give an example of where our graduates go. Our graduates, we have about, at this time, 1,500 graduates from my department. We're a young university. And we started having our graduates since 1990s. Now, for example, Alper is a tenured associate professor at Berkeley. Or, I mean, these are all young people, by the way. But if you look at, this is just my departments, and continues. And I stopped, so that's one, we ask their views. Two, if good places are taking them, that's a good quality indicator for me. Some people say, are you training for them? Some of them come back. But this is an indicator. If people want our graduates, then it talks about something. By the way, they are not PhDs. Very few PhDs. Most of them, they get their undergraduates, do their master's and doctorate in the States. But, all right. But that's an external measure. More than that, teach in Turkey, 1,500 students from graduates from my department. Our business school is the only AACSB accredited business school in Turkey, Balkans, Caucasus. We have 17 members. We have a small physics department. What we do is we go narrow so that we can hit deep. So we don't do nuclear physics, high energy physics. But in nanotechnology, there are 2 research groups, good, in Turkey. Both of them started and are in Bilkent. So just in 2007, in early December, they had 60 papers already published. They have a good... we have a symphony orchestra because, well, we do things where we think there is a gap in the country. And when we say, are you good? So they better have their CDs by EMI or others. Otherwise, and so they have to do that. We did a high school, well, pre-kindergarten to high school. And that gave us opportunity to recruit easier, because when a person you're bringing from Toronto or London or so, what happens to my children? I'm going to teach in your university. And Turkish national education system does not allow certain international benchmarks. But we were able to bury in the academic freedom of the foundation university a school where to graduate you have to have international baccalaureate. To move from, it's accredited by European Council of International Schools and New England Association of Schools and Colleges. So external benchmarking, even in our. And, well, we get, now it started working. We get creme de la creme of some of the university applicants. So we have, and when they graduate, not all of them will remain an engineer. So our responsibility to them is more than. So for example, we forced in, this was in these courses in red, and 15 to 22 students maximum in each. All engineering students have to take these. And they have to read primary texts. Yeah, English translations, but primary texts. And the people who teach them, if you look at their backgrounds, you see in Turkey, you'll find many students will choose quick payback professions, business, law, engineering. Humanities, you don't get. So we import. After all, we are equal opportunity. And in humanities, we do import a lot. But now we have a good philosophy department. For example, Donald Davidson, and they see how we teach there. Second semester, again, heavy course load, they go to one of the regular leading high schools in Ankara. They see how it's done there, and so forth. Then they go to Istanbul, others. In the second year, we got a nice agreement with Fulbright. Since 2000, when we started, they cover our costs. For 2 months, we send them to USA. In the cornfields of Iowa. They go to public schools there, they teach, they attend the faculty of education or school of education and so forth. So they get exposure. They also go to Chicago, Smithsonian, and so on. So these teachers are come out like that. And so we have a new breed of teachers. And every graduation I ask them, if I start new schools in Eastern Anatolia, would you come? Eastern Anatolia is like your Appalachians, but closer to Iran. And half of them say yes. So we started that last year. We're going to do it in 4 provinces. We started the first one last year. And again, we were able to require those international benchmarks. But we did one more thing. How do you bring good teachers to such a to far out place in Eastern Anatolia? We give them good salary. We give them good housing, furnished apartments. Most of the students in that school are Bilkent scholarship. So they are very selective. So good students. International curriculum, we give one more thing. We have a graduate school of education on the campus, and in the evenings they attend our doctoral program. In 6 years, hopefully, they can get close to their doctorate in education. What would that be? When they get out their doctorate, they'll say, Mama, I'm going to be a professor. To teach in the university, you can be a professor. You have to have a doctorate. I'm going to recruit them because these are now faculty of education professors with that kind of an experience. Those who decide to stay in the school will give them higher salary. So that's how we recruited our teachers. And we also bring classic. It's the high school, the only high school with a concert grand Steinway piano. Oh. Yes. Well, that's our Bilkent Symphony Orchestra. In Erzurum, I mean, it was history, and they get standing ovations and claps and everything. So, all right, what does Foundation University concept in Turkey mean? It's a new experiment. Everybody's trying something. We're trying now. I'm a fortunate guy. Normally I would have been in the US. But because it's my father who started it, and so like others, I said, this is a platform where you can do things. And that's what brings you there. And what it did was this. Okay, instead of only state universities, which do very nice things, you've got other ways of doing things too. It's like, should you only wear this kind of jacket, or should you be able to wear double-breasted sometimes? So this gives you flexibility of different ways of organization, provided you have accountability in your quality system, accountable to the state regulations, accountable to international others. And I must say, so far so good, and I'll be delighted to give you questions.
Well, that was an eye-opener too. Just astonishing what we're learning, and the different viewpoints, and you'll be able to contrast and compare them. The third of today's panelists, Grant Harman, Australia, an old friend, and here to talk to us. So, Grant, all yours.
Well, Chair, colleagues, let me express my pleasure in being able to participate in this very interesting discussion. My wife and I were here 3 years ago, and we enjoyed those discussions, and we remember very fondly the key issues that we talked about on that occasion. This afternoon, I want to give a case study about Australia. What I want to do is to talk about the development over the past 2 decades of private higher education. And I want to concentrate on the institutions that we define as higher education, meaning institutions that offer university-style degree and diplomas. And I won't talk about vocational and education and training, which in many countries would be community college type. I should though say that while the higher education, private higher education, enrolls somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 students out of a total of 1 million students, private vocational education and training, we understand, enrolls about 400,000 out of 1.6 million students. So some 25% of vocational education training students are in the private sector, but very little is known about that. I could have talked about other aspects of privatisation, which I'm not going to talk about this afternoon. Many of these other activities which aim to generate income for universities, to access other sources of support, are very important. And there's a long list that I'll just mention briefly, including industry research grants and income from research commercialisation, HECS and fee help. In 1974, we abolished tuition fees to increase access, but some 15 years later, another Labor government, socialist government, reinstituted tuition fees, but with a unique form of payment, deferred payment after graduation when your income reaches the average level for the community, the Higher Education Contribution Scheme. And another more recent innovation on the same line, it was designed to provide support for students who were fee-paying in public institutions. It enables them to borrow up to about 50,000 Australian dollars and repay it on graduation after their income is up to a threshold. Fee-paying postgraduate students and domestic students, 60% of our coursework postgraduate courses students pay substantial fees. 3% of undergraduate students pay fees equal to international students. This is when universities complete their enrolment quota, they can enrol students, domestic students, on a full fee basis. It's a controversial scheme, and the new Labor government promises to abolish it in 4 months' time. International students constitute a very important form of income for Australian universities. 25% of total enrolments are international students. A number of Australian universities run campuses in other countries. Some are comprehensive. Monash University, for example, has got a campus in Malaysia with about 3,500 students. And this year they will be introducing medicine. Franchising of courses, both domestically and internationally, endowed chairs and endowed buildings. Private entities owned by public universities. An interesting form of privatisation. The most ambitious example of this was Melbourne University a decade ago. It created a private university, Melbourne University Private. I think the expectation was that fees would rise in Australia and it would become a truly viable university. However, with a change in leadership in the university, that eventually was drawn back into the University of Melbourne. And then various other income-generating activities. Now, Australia seems a strange case to think about in terms of private higher education. We've had private higher education probably for 150 years, but it's been on a very minor scale. It's been largely unnoticed. Academics who have written about Australian higher education over the years have very seldom even mentioned that there was a very small and insignificant private sector. But what's happened in the last 20 years, as in a number of countries, there's been a very substantial increase in the number of private higher education institutions and in their enrolments. And I thought what might be of interest to this discussion is why this expansion took place and to look at the key policy issues that governments have addressed in Australia. Questions about definition, what do you mean by private higher education? How do you classify the variety of institutions? Statistical collections, so you know details about these institutions and their students. To look at the legislative, regulatory and quality assurance mechanisms and frameworks that have been put in place. And then issues about government financial support. It'd be nice if I could tell you it was a case study of really brilliant planning, tremendous coordination. But to a large extent, it's been a story of incrementalism, of muddling along or muddling through in the Lindblom sense, of how other policy areas and developments have impacted on higher education. And in the end, it's been a case of bureaucrats trying to seek administrative solutions long after these developments have taken place. In many ways, I see close similarities to Israel, and some of the detail that I present will contrast to detail that we heard in earlier sessions. Very briefly, the current post-school system in Australia consists of two large groups, or two separate groups of institutions. There's the public higher education, private higher education, and there's the vocational education training sector. A major complication for Australia is that we have a federal system of government. And it's a federal system where both the national government and the states and territories are both involved in education. According to the Constitution, education was to be a state matter rather than a Commonwealth or national government matter. But over the years, the Commonwealth has become involved through provisions in the Constitution, a number of provisions, but the key one is that the Constitution gives the power to the federal parliament to give grants to the states on whatever conditions they think fit. Higher education, this degree kind of institutions, there are three different groups. And I'm using the current classification, and it shows sort of the difficulty that the bureaucrats have had in terms of definition, because the first group are called Table A institutions. They don't even have a name. These are the public universities. 37 public universities and a couple, two very small government institutions. All are self-accrediting and all have their own enabling legislation. It does include a curious institution, the Australian Catholic University. Now, this was developed from Catholic teachers' colleges. In the 1980s, these teachers' colleges became colleges of advanced education, somewhat similar to state colleges in the US with government funding. And then with major reforms in higher education in the late 1980s, these colleges of advanced education were brought together in a single multi-campus, multi-state institution. Legally, it's set up as a non-profit institution. It does have enabling legislation in a number of states. It's clearly Catholic in orientation, and its terms of reference say that part of the mission is to teach a Catholic perspective on various professional areas and education. But for all administrative purposes, it really functions as a public university. So it's a very curious kind of institution which is regarded as a public institution. Table B are three private higher education institutions. They're all self-accrediting with their own enabling legislation. Bond University, Notre Dame University and the Melbourne College of Divinity. The Melbourne College of Divinity goes back to 1910, so it's almost 100 years old, and it's still a very small institution of about 800 students. Bond and Notre Dame are interesting. Both have about 6,000 students today. They're both increasingly comprehensive institutions, and they both have, from next year, medical schools. So I think they're very clearly viable institutions. They're not terribly strong in research at this time, but I think there's great promise for the future. Bond University was created by a major international corporation from Australia. It happened to go bust at the end of the 80s. But before that, it decided to create a university in conjunction with a Japanese partner. The logic behind it was that they bought a large area of land on the just behind the Gold Coast in southern Queensland, a major resort area. And the plan was to build this brand new university with impressive buildings, pause until it got going, and the value of the land increased, and then to go in for major urban development around the university and make money out of that. Unfortunately, Bond University went bankrupt. Bond Corporation went bankrupt, and Bond University had a difficult time in the first few years, but now seems to be sort of clearly on its feet, and with enrolments of about 6,000 students. Notre Dame was initially sponsored by the American university of that name, but it's an autonomous Australian university, and it was established in Perth, the city of Perth in Western Australia. It developed a branch in Broome in the northwest Australia, particularly catering to Aboriginals, but it's recently established branches in Sydney with the support of the Catholic hierarchy in Sydney. And the press explained this phenomenon that the Catholic hierarchy are somewhat dissatisfied with the increasingly secular nature of the Australian Catholic University, and so they're very keen to see sort of another Catholic university that has a more clearly religious focus. And then we have the other private providers, 100 to 150 relatively small institutions spread across Australia. It does include Carnegie Mellon's new campus in the city of Adelaide. Most of these private institutions are not-for-profit charities, or they're entities owned by professional associations, and some of them are owned by public universities. But it does include overseas universities, TAFE colleges, and for-profit providers. The TAFE colleges is interesting because these are vocational and training institutes. They're not allowed to offer degrees, but they can get into degree studies by registering as private providers. And then we have the vet sector that I mentioned, 1.6 million students with 400,000 are private providers. What's happened here is in the 1990s, there was clear government policy to encourage private providers. And each year about $200 million was up for grabs for competition to offer specified training programs. These programs are national programs. They've been developed by TAFE colleges, but private providers had the opportunity to compete against TAFE colleges, and it was on the philosophy of competition and providing more choice for students and their employers. Now let's talk about a few of the problems. There has been a major problem of definition and categorisation of these institutions. Now it seems that modern societies use a number of different means of classifying what are private institutions, what are non-government institutions. Some are based on ownership, some on funding, whether they're government funded or not, whether they've got the rights of accreditation, self-accreditation or not, the characteristics of student entry, curricula and teaching materials, do they have a particular focus, ideological, religious focus, and even in some cases on the disciplines taught. In Australia, we started with ownership, and that went probably well over 100 years, was well understood that a private institution was an institution that wasn't owned by the state. It was non-government. That worked very well until the 1980s, when we developed the College of Advanced Education sector, state colleges. And in the state of Victoria, some institutes of technology became colleges of advanced education with Commonwealth government funding. But they were strictly companies limited by guarantee. They weren't state-owned. And so the Commonwealth people realised, well, we have to change that. And so instead of saying it's based on ownership, it's based on funding. So public institutions or state institutions are those that are funded by the state, and the private are those that are not funded. Now that again worked quite well for a while, but in the last 7 or 8 years we've had the phenomenon whereby the federal government has funded some programs in non-government institutions. And so that didn't work very well as a definition. And so then we had sort of various lists of different kinds of providers. The most recent data that's come out of Canberra with regard to institutions has gone to new categories without any explanation at all. And perhaps this is sort of some indication of thinking of bureaucrats of the way we might go. They use 3 categories: universities, both public and private, all in one category; other self-accrediting institutions, and that's just a small number of institutions that have got their own legislation; and non-self-accrediting. So definition has been a major problem. And it's by no means sorted out at the present time. Then we have an even greater problem with data. We don't know precisely how many private institutions there are and what the enrolments are. The problem is that probably for the last 40 years, the Commonwealth government has taken a major role in higher education policy direction and funding. Whereas most of the public institutions are set up by the states or territories. The Commonwealth has only collected data for the institutions it funds, and until very recently has neglected all other institutions. What they're starting to do is to create collecting data at the present time for some dozen institutions, but we know there's many more than that, and the Commonwealth is in process of having a much larger data collection. In part, this may be a part of the responsibility should be borne by private institutions, because some private institutions have been quite keen not to have data collected because they believe this will mean less government regulation. There's various official lists around of institutions, but these differ in which institutions are on lists for what purposes. There is great confusion about total numbers. The Commonwealth in 1999 commissioned a project to study private higher education and come up with the lists of providers and numbers. Watson reported in the year 2000, and she estimated there were 79 private higher education institutions with a total enrolment of about 31,000. But the two lobby groups or associations that represent the private sector come up with different estimates. One says 30 to 40,000 students, another says about 50,000 students. If the 50,000 is right, that would mean there's about 5% of total enrolments in the private sector. There is the issue about the legislative base for universities. What happened was that the Australian Catholic University, Bond University and Notre Dame in the 1980s, beginning of the 90s, they all received cooperation from state governments, and legislation was passed giving them the right to operate and to grant degrees and diplomas. And more recently, the federal and state ministers working together and their officials have come up with national protocols. And these protocols deal with the issue of the establishment of universities. That a university must be established by legislation, by law, by one of the state or territory parliaments or by the Commonwealth. I was involved in 1999 in developing a plan for the first quality assurance agency for Australia. And at that time, it wasn't by no means certain whether the name university would be protected. There was one view that we ought to protect, to be very careful about who calls themselves, which private universities call themselves universities. But another view was, well, perhaps we ought to sort of, go somewhere like America and not be very concerned about the name university. However, there was a major incident, I think it must have been about year 2000 or 2001, and that is that a fairly inferior American institution that had not received accreditation in the US opened in Norfolk Island, and there was a big to-do about this. The Commonwealth had given Norfolk Island the power to regulate education, but they weren't satisfied with the outcome, and so the Commonwealth intervened, revoked the legislation, and then it was found that in a number of cases, private providers set up as companies had used the name university under the Companies Act, and so this was stopped. What we've done is to set up now a regulatory and quality assurance basis to regulate private higher education. We have an Australian qualifications framework that sets out the various awards that can be offered higher education institutions, and these must be followed by private institutions. Private institutions also have to meet certain requirements to be registered under the Australian qualifications framework. As well as that, we have quite an interesting quality assurance system, a multi-layered one. Essentially, universities are audited every 5 years by a national agency. The same agency audits the state and federal accreditation agencies. So if you're a private higher education institution, you seek accreditation at state or territory level, you satisfy various requirements about academic quality and financial viability, and then you can be registered. But in turn, you have to have each of your courses accredited by panels, largely made up of academics from universities. Government financial assistance was somewhat of a surprise that many of us didn't expect. State governments have provided some help to private universities. Recently, the Rand Labor government in South Australia gave $20 million to Carnegie Mellon to come to their state. Private universities can compete for government research grants. Financial assistance has been provided to a number of private providers to offer courses, particularly in education and nursing, and on the same basis that public universities are funded. And then Notre Dame has been funded for medicine and nursing. And the final one I've mentioned is that recently fee help has been extended to private providers. There's special registration, and to date some 64 of these are provided. The national protocols, I think, have been very important, because for the national protocols, private providers shopped around between the states, and they worked out which was the easiest state to get registration in, and they went to that state. Now there are national protocols that are agreed to by all states and followed by all states, and once you're accredited in one, you're accredited in the rest. So I notice my time is up, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you. We'll have comments now from Guiney, and given the time constraints, he'll do his 10 minutes, and we'll just have maybe a chance for a question or two. But I hope that you have the same impression that I have of the enormous variety and possibilities that are available throughout the world in this complex subject. It's certainly not an easy one. Anyhow, all yours.
Dear colleagues, I shall try and be merciful given the time of the afternoon, and whilst I've been generously allowed 10 minutes, I see if I can't get it through in less. I have basically two major points I want to comment upon. The first is the obvious range of the variety of the presentation this afternoon. We have presentations that have gone from looking at the development of one institution in one state to looking at a system level, and occasionally in Grant's case also outside, to our colleague Tilak's presentation, which gives us a panoramic view of the development of privatization in India, Southeast Asia, Japan and South Korea. Now these are sagas that unfold on vastly different scales. We have one, and from a geographical point of view, we have one transcontinental region where over half of humanity on this planet lives and has its being. We have one continent and one country. We have a demographic range of something like 2 billion inhabitants, a country with 72 million, and another one of 17 million, continent of 17 million population, which is roughly the size of the Netherlands and Europe. Now, the interesting thing that struck me listening to all the presentations with the deeply prejudiced ears of a little European is the amount of purchase that governments have managed to get over policy over the past 10 years or so. Now this is an important issue because, at least in Western Europe, it goes hand in glove with the move to urge systems towards more privatization. And when I listened to Grant's presentation just now, I said to myself, once again, it might well be that from a European perspective, Australia has beaten us to the post. And you see around the Commonwealth level, the accumulation of a considerable power of both steering and incentive and, how can you put it, prodding to move in the direction of privatization. Now, in Western Europe, we have various names for this process, and we look at them with a certain degree of, I think, trepidation, because whilst the Commonwealth level is one which is equivalent to us to the intergovernmental level, we have not yet got used to thinking outside the framework of a nation state. And our equivalent to the reinforcement of government control, which has come through our controllable systems as a result of shifting both financing and performance estimation and assessment from the input stage to the output stage, is seen as, in many ways, still conceived within the framework of the nation state. That leads to great problems, because over the past, from a period from the 1990 to about 2002, we had an orgy of creating quality assurance agencies, accreditation agencies, with the view that government should, within each nation state, should get greater purchase over what higher education ought to do, the price at which it ought to do it, and the rate at which it ought to do it. In fact, the system that we have put in place, ironically, is far more powerful than any of the other two which existed in the previous periods of modernisation I've alluded to this morning. And in this framework, I look at Australia as perhaps, and I must admit that I look at it with a certain degree of, how can I put it, trepidation, but I think would be the ambiguous way to put it, as a shape possibly of things to come with us. Only the difference is that with us it'll drift up to accumulate around Brussels. The accumulation of new powers of steering policy at the intergovernmental level, if we can make this point acceptable in the European framework, is, in my way of looking at it, a new form of trying to put a different form of coherence around higher education. You give coherence, it doesn't make very much difference that the numbers of institutions are expanding or their missions are subdividing, so long as you can in fact find a way by which what they do is comparative, irrespective of their missions, and the cost to which they do it is demonstrable, whether they are private, public, non-state, state, whatever. And this is an extremely powerful construct. In a way, its power is illustrated in a negative manner by the presentation of our good friend Tilak, who made it very clear that in precisely the areas where expansion is most rapid, where the development is almost quasi-anarchic, to use a literal term, there it becomes even more so, because precisely the power of central government, or the power of governments acting in the name of overall control, is relatively few. I would suggest, therefore, that in certain of these systems that he mentioned to us, we have, in fact, a system moving in the direction of a certain degree of incoherence, or the extreme private sector that you illustrate, in fact, is maybe a symbol of this growing incoherence that you mentioned. The second point I want to deal with has to do with that example which Dr. Dogramaci presented to us as a paean towards what I call the donatory culture. What Peter, the British sociologist, years ago called the gift relationship. Now this is extremely important because our countries we have different histories, our cultures contain different levels of generosity, of readiness to give to the public thing, to the res publica. The question that I want to raise here is that phenomenon that Tilak raised, but he put it in a rather different form than what I'm going to do. And I term this philanthropic drift. That is, first of all, what is the culture in which universities or higher education set? Is it one which regards with favour private endowment, funding? Is the relationship as active and present? Is it encouraged? Or subject to benign neglect amongst both governments and alumni? Now, to say this in this particular place is an absolute redundancy, because it is clearly very active and very flourishing. But there are countries, and I think France is not least, where the notion of public giving for private giving for public ventures such as higher education is, to say the least, vestigial. Now, Dogramaci's paper is a magnificent example of vision and generosity brought together in the construction of one establishment, of exception, by transferring and the transfer by individuals of that vision into reality. Exceptional by any standards you could care to think about. But the question that I retain from Tilak's presentation is, are we perhaps, despite these manifest examples of thought, generosity, vision, creativity, applied in few examples, in fact, in a situation where we are perhaps facing the death of philanthropy? Certainly, I mean, it is not inevitable that the gathering rush from seeing higher education as something to which you give, to becoming an agency by which you take, from becoming the object of philanthropy to becoming the way in which you literally ensure a quick buck. That is not necessarily an inevitable case. But the forces behind what's variously known as commodification, from my part of the world, are very powerful, and they need a firm national resolution to, in fact, to resist them. There are standing examples of philanthropy, but the question here, and it was one which was posed in the United Kingdom in the 2003 White Paper, was how do you, in fact, revive a philanthropic relationship? How do you create that loyalty amongst alumni towards their alma mater that naturally exists in the United States, that exists in one or two elite universities in Britain, including those that telephone their graduates to come and pay. But in generally case, it is in fact largely lacking. Here I come across a very slight comment, and it has to do with the extra resources that need to be created to permit the sustainability of a non-state sector and to make up those resources that the government or the society no longer thinks it can devote to higher education. The thing I retain from Grant's presentation is that the possibility of finding alternative non-national sources of revenue was extremely important in preventing the universities taking a defensive attitude towards it. They could go forth and, in fact, find another income stream beyond the particular state. The same thing with the Brits, although at a less spectacularly venturesome degree. British higher education, I mention this because it might have a certain importance for Israel, has two faces. The European one, and what I call the blue water prospect. It's an old dilemma in British foreign policy. That is the immediate one is Europe, but the blue water policy is going out into the world. And as Grant has said, Australia has the same particular dilemma. In repositioning itself in the Asian market, you have in fact created additional revenue generation, and in fact you have created a way by which the privatization can be accelerated. In Europe, for Britain, this is not an option. You cannot charge extra fees for overseas students, so we go for the blue water, which means to say we have to go to the world, and Europe is a second interest to us. I would suggest that in many ways there is a similarity with Israel, and I put this forward in all humbleness. To be sure, you have your blue water strategy, which is the ties with the North American continent. For this reason, you may surmise that the development of a regional higher education policy of outreach that would seek to place Israel in a position analogous to Australia in the Pacific region is going to be extremely difficult to develop, despite the concentration of talent that this nation very obviously, patently has in abundance, and despite the very obvious potential demand this region represents. In short, making up the shortfall in public expenditure, I would suggest, does not lie simply in privatization alone. And one may, in fact, one lesson one might obtain from Western Europe, from Britain, Australia, and Asia, is that the phenomenon that we all agree to call privatization, faute de mieux, is certainly rendered less fraught if there's a money stream from extra-national sources. And I put it forward to you with all humbleness that it remains to be seen whether the very particular flourishing philanthropic culture already present since the foundation of Israel, a donatory culture founded in the pietas of the sons and daughters of the diaspora, can alone be sufficient to stake up and sustain the burden that it needs to with higher education. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. We have only 5 minutes, really, and so maybe that's just one good, solid, wonderful question. Who's got a good, solid, wonderful question? Anyone? No one here? No one here?
I have a question, but not a good, solid.
We'll entertain it in the absence of any other.
My name is Zaydeman from Bar-Ilan University. Professor Tilak mentioned that the private universities in the region to which he was referring, 100% of income comes from fees. But one country that I've examined, Thailand, the private university student can get a grant, a loan towards his fees, and these loans are massively subsidised, and the government only gets about 20% back. So in fact, there is what I call a kind of a backdoor form of government subsidy to the private sector in Thailand. And I'm wondering whether this phenomenon is present in other countries in Asia where subsidized government loan schemes are increasingly available. And then, similarly, I'd like to ask Professor Harman, I know that the HEX scheme, which is seen as an ideal scheme to be adopted in many other countries, and I think that's controversial, but recent calculations have showed that only about 50% of this essentially HEX loan comes back to the government. 55%. Bruce Chapman did the calculation, I did the calculation. I understand HEX is now going to be extended to the private sector. And does that mean also then that also in Australia, basically, the government will be massively subsidising the private sector through the back door? Now, this is something that interests me. I don't know if other people are interested in the financial aspect, but these are questions I like to put.
Pretty solid question. The answer is yes or no. Well, answer first and then Grant. No, go ahead. Yeah, you're first, and then Grant will answer. That would be it then, I think.
I can speak more confidently about India, even though I think with respect to quite a few other countries also, I can try to generalize. There is a very, very significant shift in the loan mechanisms. The student loan programs, which used to be run by the governments, which used to be highly subsidized in terms of rates of interest, in terms of rates of recovery, and other conditions, are being completely replaced by commercial bank loans with full rates of interest, with full market rates of interest, if not higher, with absolutely no subsidy by the government. Exactly, that's what is happening in India. That's what has already happened in India during the last few years. That's one. So I do not think very much that the situation is different in other countries. In fact, all the countries in the region are seriously thinking about student loan programs, including Malaysia, and Thailand, and everybody is trying to move towards the markets, unsubsidized loans, because the essential purpose is to reduce the burden on the part of the government.
Other point, if I can add to Professor Guy Neave's observation, I think there's a very, very significant shift in the value system in the whole country. In India, definitely, and also in quite a few other countries in the region, with very few exceptions. Values from something like good society's concerns, poverty reduction, poor people, to personal greed, personal markets. And I think the private education system of the kind that's being developed is also contributing to this value formation of different kinds. In the sense that I pay a full fees, which means that I'm purchasing education, and I have absolutely no concern for the institution as an alumnus to pay anything.